It Will Not Last the Night by Sid Prise. It was a crisp autumn morning in the year 1922, a strange day which featured every season in its passing. The earliest morning before the dawn had seen a frost come over the Berlin streets and alleyways, an icy dew that hinted of the coming winter. But by the time the demonstration formed fully on the streets outside the Reichstag, and the chanting took the throats of the leaders of the various factions of the left in the young and already endangered Republic City, a wave of warm air, unseasonable and almost jarring in its sudden sultriness, wafted over the crowd of thousands from the east, making everyone feel they dressed too heavily. People squirmed sweatily in their greatcoats, or in the case they had no greatcoat, which was many, they found even their threadbare jackets, sweaters, dresses, and skirts uncomfortable. Had this been another era, or another place, the mob of the demonstrators might have proceeded into brazen nakedness on the Strasse, right there before God and country, and turned their angry urge to storm the Reichstag into a carnal panic of Dionysian proportions. But as it was, most people were content to be discontented, their leaders shouting their slogans, their ranks cheering and roaring approval or disapproval for what was said, and the hope amongst them all was that, somehow, all this marching and roaring might amount to something more in line with their general feeling of rage. Hope and rage. One fed off the other. This time, this place, it was fairly bursting with both, just a few years after the Great War had finally ended, after claiming the lives of millions, and the regency of more than one government. To the east, Russia was fighting to save its revolution, and in the streets of this city, men were battling either for its honor or against it. Skulls were being cracked, bones broken, blood spilt, and yet there was hope in it all. Somehow, some new phoenix was struggling to emerge from the ash. Just no one knew what name the phoenix would take, what hue its feathers would have, what banner it would carry in its sharp and certain talons. Not everyone even could agree that the ash would not just stay ash, that German, European, even world civilization itself would not just sink into ruin, now and forever. But most hoped for that phoenix. Most concluded that ruin was not the fate of humanity. After all, the war had ended, and life had gone on. What was incumbent upon them all was to figure out exactly how to rebuild, in what shape, what direction, and that uncertainty was as damning and exhilarating as anything they'd ever felt in their lives. Theodor Preiser was one who hoped for that phoenix had already risen in that land to the east, the direction of the warming wind. Strong and lean in his gray overalls and black leather cap, affixed with the red star he'd worn since he was barely more than a boy, he was of the tendency they'd named after Spartacus, a group still forming, still struggling to extricate itself from the great social democracy that had been workers' advocates since back in the 19th century, but had betrayed those workers, said many, said Theodor, by supporting their recent monstrous war, in which the workers of Germany and Austria were pitted against the comrades in France and England, leaving fields of mud and death where once flowers bloomed all over Europe. No revolutionary worker could side with the SPD anymore, Theodor concluded, and though he was young, 19 years, just turned last spring, he pledged his life to the newly formed KPD, the Communists, and stood with the new Third International instead of the bankrupt Yellow Second. But unlike his comrades, he saw no great need to shun the Social Democrats, those who, for their own reasons, still held up the three spears of its banner instead of his own hammer and sickle. And he'd been amongst those who had organized this demonstration, a united front with them, the Independent Socialists, the Communist Workers' Party, and some of the anarchist groups, to stand against the government and the fascists. For the fascists, he thought, were greater threats to Germany, to German workers, and all working people around the world, than any misguided brethren could ever be. In this, young Theodor was not in the majority on either side of the divide. SPD and KPD were fighting in the streets, and the ultra-lefts and the anarchists, ever disruptive, were fighting them both. Meanwhile, the remnants of the disbanded Freikorps and the new National Socialists were socialist only in their ironic name, were literally killing people of all these persuasions, and the Weimar government was doing very little to stop them. Indeed, this was one of the points of unity among the different sects of the left, as the purported reason for today's gathering. Just days after the government of Italy named the fascist Mussolini its prime minister, and the first government in Europe to fall to the absolute right, the threat of the rightists here was all the more ominous. A united front against fascism could end all the sectarian squabbling. and the better world they all fought for in their separate ways could finally come to be. Theodore had high hopes for the demonstration and the march to follow, which was sufficiently strong to dissuade the Bullen and the Nazis from doing anything to harm them, or so he thought. The workers and their sympathizers marched down the Strassen by the thousands away from the Reichstag, into the working-class neighborhoods of the East, their voices raised in the rousing choruses of the International, the anthem that had come out of the Paris Commune of more than 2 generations before, when all workers who were moved to revolt marched together under the same red flag, regardless of the particular politics that had evolved to divide their descendants, when all rebels sang in the same triumphant voice, "A better world's in birth." Just at the moment when the chorus thundered that verse a second time, echoing throughout the slums of the Alexanderplatz, overwhelming the bustle and the traffic and the rising of the sultry gales from the east, a great company of hundreds of armed, mounted police began charging into them from all sides. People scattered, shouting, calling on each other to resist, but there was no resistance. People who remained in the center of the street were buffeted and trampled by the horsemen, and it was all people could do to maintain themselves, let alone keep those red flags waving. Theodore was separated from his comrades in the youth brigade, and found himself running for his life into an alleyway. That's when he saw her. She'd run there too. A few of her comrades were near her, but they took flight, leaving her to fend for herself there in the darkened doorframe. "Come on," she said. She called to Theodore from the doorframe, seeing some cops coming out of the main street into the alley. "Come on, over here." Theodore did not have time to reason this out. A comrade was a comrade, even if they weren't KPD, which this Fraulein evidently wasn't. He hurried across the alley and stood beside her. "Quick," she ordered. "Kiss me." "What?" Theodore asked. But she did not wait for his reluctance to frustrate her plan. She curled up next to him, putting up a leg in the doorframe around his waist and pressed in, as if she was a grasshopper prostitute, getting him off in the alley because there was nowhere else to be. Theodore began to understand and kissed her deeply. Only then did she really reflect on what she looked like. She was dressed very modern, with a short, tassel-fringed black skirt going down no further than her knees, long, poisonous green leather boots laced tight halfway up her calves, with white ribbons making stylized bows on top. Her body was thickly attractive, curvy and supple, hot against his. Her face was bright, olive, and rounded, her coal-streaked eyes somewhere between blue and gray, and her hair cut short in a Bubikoff page-boy style, tapered on the sides, a little longer in front, peeked from beneath the stylish black cloche, a color so red that it actually bordered on the pink. Her arms were rounded the shoulders, dressed in a white false ermine fur, but otherwise bare, with a skimpy, lacy, almost diaphanous black blouse, her breasts beneath its folds the gentle curves of a modest Venus de Milo. They pressed sharply against Theodore's lean chest as she kissed him, as if she were enjoying the little deception. Some polizei galloped by, but they didn't give this couple a second glance. A prostitute and her John, they concluded, or some young lover's tryst. They didn't have time for such things. The woman opened her eyes, glanced sideways as she kissed Theodore, then closed them again. After a moment, the two fell away, though they still stood quite close in the doorframe. "We'd best stay here a minute or two," she said, looking away, down the alley toward the Strasse. "More pigs might come." "Right," said Theodore. "What's your name?" She looked at him and chuckled a little. "You like to know the names of the gals you kiss, huh?" Theodore smiled. "Usually, yeah." "Well, my name's Katerina. What's yours?" "Theodore." "Huh, sexy name." "Thank you. I've always liked your name, too." "Well, then," and she kissed him quickly again, her leg up on suggestively, as more Bullen rode by. As before, they went on without notice. The noise from the Strasse was dying down. People were being recovered, or arrested, or what have you, and the march was effectively over. Still, it made sense to stick to the subterfuge of a few more moments at least, and they did just that. Kissing was a wonderful decoy, Theodore wondered. Theodore wondered why he had never thought of it before. She giggled at length when the dangers had passed and said, "You're probably not safe in the streets now. Neither am I, alone. Say, Liebling, you want to come up to my place, just till the heat dies off?" Theodore chuckled. This was the strangest way he had been introduced to a girl, and he said so. She just shrugged off this comment as if there was nothing really all that strange about it. He assented to her offer, and the two began to walk down the alleyway. I was a little afraid I'd have to fuck you, Theodore, she said, coyly over her shoulder, just to make it look good. Tell me, Zusa, would you have minded that? Theodore answered this with a chuckle, at first light and nervous, then, as he thought about it, a hearty one. Well then. They walked through alleys nearly the whole way, in a jerky roundabout path toward a seedier neighborhood of the city, on the outskirts of the Alex, talking a little, but mostly suspending discussion till they could get somewhere safe.